Hi, everyone, and welcome to part two of the interview I did of famous comic book historian Roy Schwartz, who has gained popularity and, in some cases, notoriety, not because of the work he has done, but because of the bold title that he has come up in the book, Is Superman Circumcised? The topic or the title of the book may be really bold, but it touches upon a very important aspect of our favorite superhero, the icon himself, Superman. And many of us throughout our lives were made to believe a lot of things that were hardly connected with the reality. Before I go any further, I would like to welcome Roy Schwartz by thanking him to give me his time once again to talk about his book. Roy, thank you.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be back. Last time was a lot of fun, one of my favorite interviews ever. So
Thank
I'm
you.
excited to be here again.
Thank you so much, man. Thank you. Thank you. So, Roy, in the previous interview, what we did was we tried to understand who is Roy Schwartz, what was his motivation to write something that might raise eyebrows. And ever since I published that interview on my Facebook and my YouTube, and I started to share across within my circles, a lot of people were either blown away. Some of them were calling it propaganda. Some of them said that, what kind of title is that? Because for a lot of people, as you have addressed in this book, Superman was a Jesus-like figure. So without further ado, the first part I want to talk about is the Jewish discourse that you have discussed in great detail, and I have labeled it the Jew in America. The reason is that a lot of us, especially those of us who are in the Arab world, Arab and Muslim world, are not aware, and you had highlighted this in the previous interview, that how much whitewashing has happened, especially within the American media and much of the Western media, whereby they always try to portray themselves as people who always cared for the Jewish community. But when we read the book, we realize that not only the Jewish community was kept at bay, and you famously mentioned the voyage of the damned, and that was just one incident that happened. You also highlighted the inter-Jewish schism that was prevailing between Jews who who came from Germany in the 1840s and settled in the US, and how they looked down upon the comic book industry, whatever the work that was being produced. I would like you to just basically take my audiences through about that.
So you're right. Every nation edits its own history. It kind of mythologizes its own history. Just like people, we remember what we want to remember and the way we want to remember it. And American culture and American entertainment really likes to remember itself as always being very tolerant, very pluralistic, very accepting. That just wasn't the case. If you were not a WASP, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and into the 1960s, even Catholics who didn't count,
Yeah.
they were like borderline not white in the kind of scheme of things. You were on the outside. And while the level of persecution and violence against Jews in America was nothing compared to Europe, compared to Germany during the Nazi regime, nonetheless, if you were Jewish in America, you could not get a good job in a good place, definitely not in presentable industries like glossy magazines and journalism and publishing and things that if you're creative, what are you going to do? So in the case of the comic book industry, Jewish entrepreneurs, Jewish writers, Jewish artists, they brought their talents to comics because they had nowhere else to bring them to. And that's how that came to be. The American mythology, and I don't mean to sound conspiratorial. I don't think there was a conscious decision to present things wrongly. I just think people remember things the way they want to remember them. If you go and ask an average American today, who was our main enemy in World War II, they will say Nazi Germany. In the American mythology, and you see it in American movies about World War II, you see it in TV shows and books, America took on the Nazis. The fact is that culturally, America didn't care about the Nazis. They cared about the Japanese enemy in the Pacific theater, the Germans being far secondary thought. And that's something I never quite knew until I researched the book. And what I looked wasn't about the factual history, but
Right.
the representation of it in American entertainment at the time, meaning 1940 through 1945. And you look at movies, and you look at radio shows, and you look at TV shows, and you look at books, and the Nazis are like 10% of it. They really focused on the Japanese enemy.
Right.
Only after the war did America decide, oh yeah, well now that we know what the Nazis were up to in the concentration camps, no, we won, we defeated them, we were the ones. But that's really only partially true. But there's one exception to this whole story, and that is comics, because there was a Jewish industry, and it sort of flew below the cultural radar, and because it was considered cheap, and because it was considered for kids, and because it was, you thought of a story one day, and 3 months later it's on a shelf. It's not like a movie that takes 2 years to. It was sort of almost like an open door to the cultural world, to the unconscious mind of the creators, to the kind of inner world. When you look at comics from the period, unlike any other entertainment media, they were focused almost exclusively on the Nazis
Right.
because it was a Jewish industry. And that particular distinction is one that hasn't been made before, that I thought was fascinating.
Okay. Secondly, the most important thing that you had highlighted in this one was that despite all of this, the comic book industry was, correct me if I'm wrong, was mostly dominated by Eastern European Jews from very impoverished backgrounds who also had sought refuge in America, who were lucky enough to gain entry because the United States at the time was trying to push back as many Jewish immigrants as possible. But there is a character, I don't know if I'm using the right term, but there is a person, Professor Wertheimer, correct me if I'm wrong, who wrote the book.
Dr. Friedrich Wertheimer.
Dr. Friedrich Wertheimer, who wrote the book Seduction of the Innocent. And because of your book, we came to realize that there was an aspect of people of Jewish community, of Jewish backgrounds migrating to the United States in the late 19th century from Germany. Now, despite the fact that America, the Waspian-dominated America was keeping these Eastern European Jews at bay, or as you famously say, that embracing them, but keeping them at an arm's length. How are these Jews who were coming from the German philosophical schools and who were coming from a rich background, if you will, how are they able to dominate the scene within the American discourse during the time?
It's an interesting story, and also something that hasn't really been discussed in the context of comics, even though it's a big part of it. And, human beings are pretty much the same everywhere, even in the smallest groups of people, even the most persecuted groups of people. People will still find ways to discriminate amongst themselves. I have brown hair and you have black hair, and I have green eyes, and people always find ways. I like peanut butter and you like Nutella. I'm better than you. There's always something. People find ways. In the case of the Jewish community then, there are two big influxes of Jews to America.
Right.
And one was in the mid-1800s, 1840s, it really started. And these were German and Austrian Jews, meaning Western and a bit of Northern European Jews. They were highly educated. They were very rich. They were very secular, fully assimilated. They were usually either Jewish only by birthright. They didn't practice in any way, didn't believe anything, or they were Reform, a very, very liberal way of, you fast in Yom Kippur, you go to synagogue once or twice a year, you're done, you call it a day.
Okay.
They were not observant.
Okay.
And they managed to come to America very conveniently. They came to America not as refugees. They didn't run away. They could bring all their money with them, all their belongings with them. They didn't, have to run from their homes with a suitcase kind of thing.
Right.
And they assimilated really well. And they did not, and we're talking generalizations. We're talking about a few thousand people, all kinds of types. They didn't want to be thought of as Jews. They wanted to be thought of only as Americans. And whenever they could pass for a WASP, they did. And those families, they established a lot of American enterprises like the New York Times. That's the Ochs-Sulzberger family. It's two families that merged. And they came to be known as the R crowd. And then we fast forward a little bit, and we are at the beginning of the 20th century, the Bolshevik Revolution. You have these pogroms, these impromptu campaigns of massacre against Jews in all their little villages along the Pale of Nations. You have the rise of Nazism in Europe, and in that interwar period, meaning right before World War I, and right after, you had this huge influx of Eastern European immigrants, Russia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, blah, blah, blah. And they all came to America, and now we're talking about 1 million people. That's a much bigger number.
Oh, okay.
And in 1924, America passed a law called the Johnson-Reed Act
Yes.
that was designed to to limit the number of undesirables from coming to America. And they really brought immigration down to a halt from all these countries, allowing the Germans and Italians and Irish, but that's it, right? The Christian white people. And that wasn't changed till the 50s. So it was basically a death warrant to most of Europe's Jews. And that was sort of the situation. And the Western European Jews, and again, we're talking broad strokes, it takes all kinds, but a lot of the rich, well-to-do, well-assimilated Western European Jews did not care for their Eastern European brethren. It's the city mouse versus the country mouse, educated and not educated, secular or reform versus religious, proud, trying to hide being Jewish versus being proud to be Jewish. Again, broad strokes, but and they didn't get along. They did not get along, and the Germans did not care for these Eastern European brethren coming in and making a big splash of things. And that type of cultural tension is where I think the roots of Wertheim's attitude is. Now, Dr. Friedrich Wertheim, Dr. Friedrich Wertheimer, was a German Jew.
Okay.
He didn't come exactly 1840. He wasn't that old, but he is of that school of thought. He was born in Germany. He moved to America. He was an extremely educated, extremely intelligent, and extremely well-known psychiatrist. Among many other things, he was the head of the Bellevue. It's a famous psychiatric hospital back in the day. The head of their criminal psychiatric wing. He was the head psychiatrist for the New York State Supreme Court. He was very, very serious and renowned. And he was also considered a very good guy, champion of justice. He gave free services to people in Harlem. He opened a clinic that charged like $1. They charged very nominally, gave free service. He was very anti-segregation. His testimony was instrumental in Board versus the Board of Education, 1984, the Supreme Court case that desegregated schools in America. So he was, but he was also a very snobbish, very priggish, very judgmental man. He did not only did he probably not care for the Eastern European Jewish culture, but he didn't care for anything born of mass culture, movies, TV, radio shows. If it wasn't, he was a big snob. And what he did, and you can still see it today, is that he used his credibility as a expert on mental health to lend credence to his personal opinions.
Yes.
And you still see people, they talk on TV, these talking heads, these experts on CNN. This person is an expert on politics. Why is he talking about, the idea is that if you're educated and knowledgeable on one thing, that doesn't make you anything in a different thing. That's just not how that works. But that's how people assume it to be. So he went on this campaign against comic books, which he hated. And he wrote this book, came out in 1954, called Seduction of the Innocent, in which he made a preposterous claim that juvenile delinquency, from violence to drug abuse, can be is significantly contributed to and is rooted in comics. The argument is that a perfectly normal, well-adjusted, mentally healthy American boy can pick up a Superman comic, and the next moment he's shooting up heroin and setting homeless people on fire. It's just really ridiculous. Now, for today's sensibility, that sounds ridiculous, but people believed it. It created nationwide panic. Yeah. It was a bestseller. He was all over the radio. He was giving lectures. It was a huge thing. And by the way, his main, he makes all kinds of crazy claims that I put in the book that I thought were, they're so crazy, they're a farce. They're funny today, but people took them seriously. Batman and Robin are gay lovers. Yeah. Why? Because when you see Wayne Manor, it has flowers and vases, which clearly, it's crazy things. And but it was taken seriously.
He was expecting maybe that Wayne Manor would be having like weapons and aggressive stuff, alpha male stuff. Okay.
He had a lot of, Yeah, Wonder Woman was a potent lesbian who wanted to take over men just by virtue of the fact that she managed to punch bad guys, and a woman should never be able to punch a man. Just logic that today seems farcical, but people took it seriously. And his main argument, aside the fact that years later they looked into his research records and found that he outright falsified things, meaning he completely lied, but that's a whole different level of things.
Right.
His main logic was that all of his juvenile delinquent patients were reading comics, therefore, comics are to blame for juvenile delinquency. He could have just as easily blamed air or water because clearly all his patients breathed air and drank water. The logic is insane. But again, people took it seriously. People were burning comics in big pyres, which is part of why old comics are so valuable.
Exactly.
There was a Senate investigation. Now, it was front page news everywhere. And even though that Senate subcommittee investigation ended up concluding that not only do comics not harm healthy, well adjusted children, they actually provide some benefit in health through role models, through dealing with problems through hyperbole and metaphor. But by that point, the press didn't care. That's not where the press goes. The press goes into where the
Negativity.
salaciousness is, right? Where the press lights things on fire, it doesn't put them out. That's not how that works. So it created a huge issue, and it really crippled the comic book industry for decades. And those stigmas are still around today sometimes.
But Roy, I want you to tell my viewers, because
Hmm.
I wanted to take this honor, but I would rather give it to the author himself because he has done the hard work behind it. What was Professor Friedrich Wertheimer's opinion about Superman?
Well, that's an interesting one. He attacked Superman more than anybody, particularly publicly. In his book, he doesn't dedicate as much disproportionate attention to Superman, but Superman was the biggest, most famous superhero. By that point, by 1954, he was a household name in America and around many countries in the world. Um, so even though the character himself, you could argue, is the most wholesome of them all. I mean, how much violence do you see in a Superman comic? How much horror? How much sexuality? Not that much. He really latched onto Superman because he was a publicity hound, right? At the end of the day, he was a hack. He was looking for the headlines.
Right.
So on the very first day of the Senate hearing, and um, the hearings were held here in New York, he stood up and said, Hitler was a beginner compared to these comic book people. This is a Jew calling other Jews worse than Hitler a decade after the Holocaust. It's really mind-boggling. And he said that Superman is a Nazi. Basically, he said that Superman is the Nietzsche Nazi Übermensch, which he's not only is he not, he was a reaction to it. He's the counter argument. I have a whole article about that in Philosophy Now that came out not too long ago. He claimed that the S was, he said, well, I should be thankful it's not an SS. That the very idea of Superman is fascist, and it teaches children to be fascists and violent, or alternatively, submissive and followers of fascists and violent people. And that the damage that Superman has done to the children of the world cannot be underestimated. And he made all these arguments. He, at some point, wrote that women are impliedly being raped in Superman comics. And where? There's no evidence. He doesn't back that up. He doesn't feel he needs to. He feels his name is enough. And he makes this incendiary, claim one after the other. And again, for today, it sounds bonkers. It sounds like panicked hysteria, but it was very effective propaganda on his end.
Well, you heard it straight out of the author's mouth. And Superman in the 1950s was labeled as a fascist, a tool of propaganda for Hitler, according to Professor Friedrich Wertheimer. I am really grateful to God Almighty that I'm not alive in that time. Either I would have been crying or I would have been laughing out loud. Now, the second part of the interview is that this is the environment for two Jewish teenagers in Cleveland, Ohio, who are seeing the problems, that not problems, but in fact a human catastrophe that is emerging in Europe. And maybe some of them have relatives back in Europe who are trying to seek refuge in the United States. And they go on and create this character in its current form, because Superman was, as per your book, was created in 1933, the reign of Superman. But the current incarnation, where we have Clark Kent as the refugee who pays back to the home country, What is really interesting about is that in the first part, when I was asking you about the schism between the elite German Jewry versus the downtrodden Eastern European Jewry, you used a word called assimilation. And then there is this thing that when Siegel and Shuster were imagining and providing an origin to Superman and everything, they made Krypton cold, very rational, lack of emotion, something that would represent Europe, because Europe was all about philosophies. Europe was all about the German engineering that was taking the world by storm. And then there was this guy, Friedrich Nietzsche, if I am pronouncing his name correctly, the famous German philosopher, who went so far ahead and he declared death of God. And he presented the Übermensch. How did Superman fit into this scenario in the real world, what Siegel and Shuster were doing?
Just like Superman has evolved with the times, right?
Right.
It's still Superman. We recognize him. Same character, same costume, same idea, but he's changed with the times, so the depiction of Krypton has also changed. And before the war, Krypton, first of all, wasn't that important. It was this is how he got his powers by, and then you move on to the story, you know.
Right.
It was a prologue and nothing more, but it was a very generic fantasy of a futuristic scientific utopia. There are some interesting angles to it where the highest value is pursuit of knowledge and preservation of knowledge, which is a very Jewish cultural
Tradition, yes.
tenet, and not that much of an American one, mind you. There's a distinction to be made there. Certainly not then. And America has, what's called the Jeffersonian ideal of working the land with your hands and that kind of, symbol of virtue and self-reliance and crucible of morality and virtue. It's a slightly different thing.
It centers on the agrarian lifestyle. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I mean, in Jefferson's time, there was really no urban. That came just after the Industrial Revolution, came a little bit after him. But that kind of mentality really stayed, right? And it really was after the war where the full horrors of the Holocaust came into light that Krypton really started getting developed as a post-Holocaust metaphor for what was going on.
Right.
And we find out that Krypton was a pretty hostile terrain, that people in Krypton lived in city-states that were kind of reminiscent, not so much of the Greek city-states of old, but of the shtetls of Eastern Europe, these small village communities that Jews were only allowed to live in.
Right.
And they could travel and trade with each other, but they could never actually live anywhere else. So it sort of reminds you of a high-tech sci-fi version of that.
Right.
Take the shtetl, turn it into Wakanda, and you get that sort of, Krypton.
And also was based on the shtetl.
Yeah, is how I interpret it.
Yeah.
But there's certainly those echoes, and all of a sudden you have these stories of Superman trying to learn more about his old culture that was lost and the world that was destroyed, and he tries to go back and save it, and he fails, and he tries to preserve elements of it, and he fails. There are all these stories, Superman's Return to Krypton, where he goes back in time and tries to save it, but he can't do it. He discovers other survivors that he didn't know existed, which is a very common story for Jews after the war. Families got apart, people ran away, people all of a sudden after the war, this sister made it, that sister didn't make it. Those kind of stories were very common. So all of a sudden he has a cousin, Supergirl, that he had no idea made it. You have other stories like the Three Phantom Zone criminals that came in that period. So that to me, in the context of this particular metaphor, echoes the idea that maybe your mom and dad didn't make it. Maybe your best friend didn't make it, but maybe the neighbor down the road who you remember being an asshole, pardon me, did make it. That's not fair. So that to me sort of replicates the fact that not everybody who made it was the good guy necessarily, right? That's just the unfairness of war in general. So you have all these kind of things. And of course you have Kandor, which for you guys who don't know or remember, it's a city on Krypton that managed to survive because it was miniaturized and kidnapped by an alien called Brainiac. Now, Krypton exploded, it wasn't on Krypton, and it survived, and Superman finds it and rescues it, but he can never make them large again. And for some reason they care and they stay in the city. I mean, who cares if you're this small, if you can fly around and go anywhere, but fine, whatever. So Superman has this miniaturized city of Krypton that numbers 6 million people. They say there's 6 million people in it. That's a very evocative number right after the Holocaust. Think about that. For a Jew, a few years after the Holocaust, to tell a story about a group of survivors in a city that sort of made it and happens to number 6 million is very evocative. It's very the strong echo there of things. So you have all these kind of metaphors, one after the other. The I think that sort of answers the question, right?
Yeah. Now, this is the part where we are talking about the European connection, and then the with Krypton, and followed by what you have clearly highlighted, that over the years when Krypton's origin was developed, it was basically modeled after the Jewish tradition of pursuit of knowledge, that Kryptonian society was reflected as that. But now what we are looking at is we have a model immigrant who is telling kids in America and those adults who like comics that it's okay to accept an immigrant because that immigrant is going to be grateful to you. And at the same time, he, for some decades, is basically trying to show that how hard a refugee, how hard it is for a refugee to assimilate him or herself in the host nation. Now, in that respect, you have elaborated on a lot of concepts, a lot of terminologies that are within Judaism. Thanks to you, I also realized that in Judaism, yes, faith is important, but in Judaism, you remain a Jew even if you renounce the religion, because ethnically, your Jewishness travels from your mother. So is Superman, in today's terms, an assimilated American, or is he still an immigrant?
It's a good question. I'll backtrack a little bit. And, the thing about Judaism is that it's first and foremost a peoplehood.
Right.
And then it's a culture, and then it's a religion. If you think of the Bible, for example, Judaism didn't exist until Mount Sinai, until the Exodus from Egypt and Mount Sinai, and Moses going up the mountain and coming back down with the Ten Commandments and the
Right.
Torah. That's when the religion came into being, but that's already several books into the Bible. So what was it before? So it starts as the Hebrews, right? Abraham, who comes from today's Iraq, from Ur, right? And then there's once Jacob, right? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Once Jacob changes the name to Israel after he wrestles with the angel, then they're the Israelites, which is the sons of Jacob. So first are the Hebrews, then they're the Israelites, and only at Mount Sinai do they become Jews. Only then is there a religion.
Aha.
So that sort of understanding and self-identification has always accompanied Jewish culture.
Right. Okay.
So in the mindset of Jews, you can say, I don't believe in any of it, I'm an atheist, or I'm going to worship Satan. It doesn't matter. If you're born to a Jewish mother, you are Jewish. That's it. You can join, but you can't ever leave. If you're ethnically. So in that sense, you have all these stories of Superman, renouncing being Superman, but at the end, there's always a little surprise, like, oh, he actually is still Superman, right? There's always that little. So that's basically that. And there's all these. Look at the movie Superman 2.
Yeah.
Where he wants to give up, he wants to marry the Shiksa, he wants to be with Lois. He brings her home to meet his mom, right?
Yeah.
Like, and he's willing to give up, not just who he is, but what he is in order to be with her, which of course we know just from kind of secular culture, regardless of that, is that if you're giving up who you are to be with somebody, then it's not the right person for you, right? But aside from that, he eventually does. He gives up his powers. He gives up being Superman. He gives up his Kryptonian tradition because it destroys the fortress, right? The council. And he immediately regrets it. And also Lois sort of basically falls out of love with him instantly. Like the moment he gets beaten up in that diner by Rocky, the truck driver. And he manages to re-energize himself, but that's at the cost of that little green crystal, the last of the energy. And then he loses his, so the idea is that you can try and renounce, and it's the wrong thing to do, at least in as this movie argues. But he's always a Kryptonian. You're always Jewish as far as that metaphor goes. When Superman was created in the 30s and in the 40s, there was no such thing as being proud of your ethnic identity. That's a modern concept.
Right.
Nobody walked around and said, I am Jewish, I am black, I am Sunni, I am like that doesn't exist. That's there was WASP, and that's it. That's all American. All American is white, blonde, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant,
That's it.
Yeah, and if you weren't that, then the thing to do was to pass. And to the most part, people even didn't think about it as hiding. They just thought about like, well, that's what being an American means. It means you come to America, you get off the boat, you immediately get rid of your ethnic garb of whatever you came from. You got a nice suit, put on a fedora, Clark Kent, right?
But
Um, and you become an American. And you have these stories about how people, not just Jews, but all kinds of people would send postcards. Back then, you could take a photo and turn it into a postcard to send the family. That sort of a
yeah,
they were, and you see these old postcards from the 30s and 40s where everybody's wearing suits to show the relatives back home that they've become American.
yeah,
That's Clark Kent, you know. Um, both Siegel, both Shuster's dad, as well as a bunch of other comic book creators' fathers, were suit makers or suit salesmen.
yes,
That's a very strong, you know. And Clark Kent, on the other hand, Superman, the ethnic character, what's his outfit? From day one, his outfit is the fabrics his mother wrapped him in when she put them in the vessel. That's his ethnic fabric, his ethnic garb, his
ethnic.
tallit, if you're Jewish, his whatever. So, you know, again, looking at it from a metaphor, but it's a very solid metaphor, he hides his ethnicity, his colorful ethnic garb, under his clothes, under his suit. But that means that every time there's a job for Superman, every time he steps into that phone booth and he opens his shirt, he's not just declaring his personal two identities, but his cultural and ethnic two identities. He's declaring himself to be Kryptonian. So it's this ultimate assimilation slash assertion fantasy. And it's I can pass by anybody, but I'm still special. I'm like everybody else, but I'm still unique. It's having it both ways, and that's the fantasy of an immigrant, right?
True. And this is something basically when I was reading all of this, it was reminding me about the recent trials of Syrian refugees uh, who were being disregarded or rejected by much of Western Europe because, again, the undertone is that they will not assimilate because of their religious, ethnic background. At the same time, it also, the suit salesman thing, it finally solved a mystery for me. Why Seinfeld's father was a suit salesman.
It's actually a little known fact I do put in the book that in the early days of fashion, before it was factories, before everything was shipped off to Bangladesh, and before everything, the Lower East Side, which was the poor Jewish neighborhood in New
Yes.
York, that's where all fashion was made. When a lady bought a dress at Macy's, that was made a few blocks down south, and you know you just had these seamstresses sitting and all day long making clothes. It was a Jewish industry in the majority, and that sort of sweatshop structure where you had a giant room and you had
Right.
a bunch of people, and you know, and one sewed the back, and then she moved it, and the other one sewed the chest, and she moved the one that sewed the dress, and you moved the one that sewed the buttons. That work structure was what became the comic book workshops, where one did the writing, then the other one the typing, then the other did the pencils, one did the inks. That's where it comes from. They had the space and they were used to that method of work, and that's how they managed to produce so much so quickly. They basically did what they did before, which is fascinating. And that you know, comic books to this day are created in a way that originally came from the Jewish way to make clothes, which is you know, and not something I had any idea about until I researched the book and started finding these connections. And it's interesting, and as you're right, just like even before we go into something as dramatic as Syrian refugees who are not accepted in France because they're afraid that they would be, you know, not assimilated French values, even in a much less dramatic, much more common. What do you do if it's Friday night and your dad wants you to come to the mosque to prayer, but the pretty girl at school you really like wants you to come with the gang to listen to some records at the malt shop? What do you do? That's the dilemma of Clark Kent or Superman, right? Every time he has to step out on Lois with some flimsy excuse, that's the metaphor for it. It's a constant tug of pull of identities.
It was a very good metaphor because it helps us understand and quite a lot what happens is that because of all the conflict in the Middle East for the last 70 years and of all the yellow journalism that has been there and of all the rhetoric that has been there, what remained missing in all of this is that today a refugee who is a Rohingya, for example, a Palestinian refugee, for example, or a Syrian refugee, for example, and I'm using the examples from the Muslim world, if they come across the fact that what their Abrahamic brethren had to go through in the World War II era, it was nothing different. Being rejected, being looked down upon, being harassed, being exploited. And this is something that I mean, I don't know. I mean, my question is, should we, as people of the Abrahamic community, look at Superman as our ultimate modern symbol, because he represents the struggles and the desire of so many people who first of all not only want to find a better life because of war and persecution, but also they want to give back to people who show kindness to them.
Yes, the short answer is yes. Here's the thing. Let's look at Moses, or then Jesus, or then Muhammad. What's more important? Whether or not they said what they said, whether they existed, or what is it actually that they're saying? Is it the message or the factuality of the messenger? It's the message. It doesn't matter, what the actual historicity of it is. It matters the message. It's either makes sense or not. You either have something to learn from it or not. And the fact that Superman is fictional doesn't matter. He's fictional, but he's a projection of something real. He came from somewhere real. And what he has to teach us is something real. And it's about tolerance,
Yes.
and it's about acceptance, and it's about stepping up for the weak.
Yes.
Long before he was known as the Man of Steel, his original tagline was champion of the oppressed.
Yes, which you highlighted.
It's about truth and justice. And, the American way is something that was very specific to his creation, but what do they mean by that? They mean peace and pluralism. They mean acceptance of a bunch of people. They mean freedom. These are values that are universal.
And
right?
the American way, you clearly pointed out in your book, it's not something that comes out from the State Department. It is the values that you highlighted.
Exactly, right. It's not American politics, it's American values. And it's only said as American values because it's an American character for an American audience, but it's universal values, right? It's about the humanity of it. And truth and justice is, in Superman, as we've discussed today, he's an immigrant, but what a powerful symbol. You have this baby, refugee, the parents didn't even come with the baby. The parents couldn't come. They sent the baby, which is a very familiar story to refugees from anywhere, particularly for Jews in the Holocaust, for everybody from everywhere. And this baby lands, and there's nobody to wait for him, and he's defensive. He's not that super when he's a baby in any version of the story. He's a baby. But the reason he survives isn't because he's the mightiest or the toughest. It's because the kindness of two people find him.
Yes.
It's the kindness of an American couple who teach him how to be a good person, who teach him the values. And this guy grows up, and he develops superpowers. And those superpowers come from his heritage, from his ethnic heritage, from his Kryptonian background. And he uses the power of his original culture for the benefit of his host culture. He's a very powerful reminder that being an American is being an immigrant, and that there's a huge value in accepting people from different cultures and the benefit and the gifts that they bring with them. And that's what makes America so unique, and that's what makes all of us as humanity unique, is that we all bring something else to the table. I think that's a very, very powerful symbol.
I have to thank you for one thing, that a lot of times what happened was, because I used to be a history buff, and I left it for quite some time because it was quite depressing, because the more you understand realities, the more you see things, the more you read about each and every people, it just makes you feel depressed. But what used to happen was that even when I am let's say reading American political science, and I'm reading about books that are written by Eastern European Jews who are neocons, in their discussion, what happens is that they always tend to pretend that there is Judeo-Christian values, but in their writings, they never acknowledge the fact that Muslims also believe in a lot of those values. You, on the other hand, when I started reading the book from the first pages and wherever you got the opportunity, you included the Muslims in Islam in the narrative. Because Prophet Moses, may God's peace and blessings be upon him, is the most mentioned prophet in the Quran. I was counting that a lot of the prayers that we recite for any specific reason, they are related to Prophet Moses, peace and blessings be upon him. And the story in itself of Prophet Moses' mother actually putting him in a basket, and for his safety, this is a story that is shared between the Judaic, Christian, and Muslim community. But I think, to my limited knowledge, because I have read quite a deal of American books, whether it was political philosophy, whether it was current affairs, whether it was in general about the culture of America or something like that, I think this book is the first time that includes Islam as part of the discussion when it comes to the Judeo-Christian discourse, and especially in particular to Superman. I wanted to compliment you on that part.
Well, thank you. That's a big compliment. That makes me very happy. Thank you. Yeah, I think like, it belongs there. Listen, what are the three monotheistic religions if not it's one tree with three branches?
Yes.
One tree, one trunk, three branches. That's what it is. And you can say this branch looks nice, that branch looks nice. It's the same tree, you know. And I'm going to give people the benefit of the doubt that the term Judeo-Christian became idiomatic in the West, in Europe, and in America, not so much as a tool of exclusion, but just because those were the demographics, those were the populations. So, you have a lot of this and you have a lot of that, so you put it together. But that's the benefit of the doubt. I'm sure it's been used, it's been weaponized by people with ill intentions. That's always the way things work out. But
it got weaponized in my experience ever since the 9/11 thing happened. Because the point that you've made is very valid.
That's been weaponized since forever, yeah.
Yeah, because if somebody tells me in the 60s that America believes in Judeo-Christian values, that's perfectly understandable to me, because the demographic in the United States having adherents of Islam is very small. There are hardly immigrants or refugees coming in from Muslim lands during the 60s. Things started to change in the 80s. And then, like you said, the weaponized part, I personally feel that it happened maybe after 9/11 primarily. But to give you the credit.
I'm not.
Yeah.
Like, it was important for me to be accurate. It wasn't so much as affirmative action, it wasn't so much about, it's just to be accurate and be fair and say, here are the things that are. It's like Venn diagrams, right? So some places all three circles will overlap, and some it's just going to be these two, and some just these two, and some just this one, and like anything else. But yes, I try to be accurate, and I have the benefit of sort of having at least some knowledge in all three that I can talk about it. And where I didn't have the knowledge, I did the research and talked to the people. But I also on a couple points mentioned Buddhist concepts, so it's whenever it was appropriate. But it makes me very happy that you noticed that I made the effort to be much more comprehensive than what some people have before me.
Yeah. And there's a reason behind that, because I wanted to mention it at this specific point, because as I said, that because I'm a history buff, I had the opportunity to explore the exegesis of the Quran. And one of the most prominent scholars in that particular field happens to be Ibn Kathir. And his exegesis of the Quran is like a standard bearer to this day. And while I was studying that, and while I was discussing the matter, what I came across was that Muslim scholars, and even from the time after the Prophet, when the caliphs, the four righteous caliphs were there, Muslims would refer to the Torah for any additional reference, which opened up my eye about one thing. And all this time, I was like, something is right in front of me, and I wasn't able to realize. Superman does not kill. Batman does not kill. Daredevil doesn't kill. Spider-Man doesn't kill. This no-kill approach, what I realized was that in the Quran, there is a verse that says, if you save one human life, you have saved the entire humanity. And if you kill one human life, you have killed the entire humanity. Now, what's the
Torah has the exact same one, yeah.
Yeah. Now, what's the story that comes before this verse? The story of Cain and Abel. And when I was going through the exegesis of it, the Muslim scholars referred to the Torah, not the Talmud, that what was there. And because in Islam, when it comes to the Quran, the rule is very strict. That let's say, even if you come across the saying of a prophet, which has been certified as authentic, but it is in conflict with the message in Quran, then the saying is out. So the same thing is applicable to when we are taking references from the Torah and stuff like that. The story in the Torah is exactly the same, the way it is being described in the Quran. And then God has given us this commandment that if you kill one human life, you have killed the entire humanity. And thus, this value is enshrined by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster in the icon. And this icon becomes the standard bearer, and most of the heroes live by this value. I was really blown away by this.
That's very cool. I mean, yeah, these are the values. The very idea of what heroism is a monotheistic idea. I think you and I discussed this in our
Last
part one of this interview. Before the three monotheistic religions, the concept of heroism had nothing to do with community service or dedication to others or sacrifice for others. From Gilgamesh to Hercules to whatever. There's exceptions in non-Western canon, but I don't want to get too detailed here. It's about glory and reputation and immortality and riches and revenge, and it's all these kind of things. But the humble leader servant, the one who's dedicates their whole life to the community or sacrificed their life, that's a monotheistic concept of heroism, and that is exactly what superheroes personify.
You had mentioned and elaborated on this part in our previous interview.
Mm-hmm.
But this no-kill thing, it just, completed the entire, how should I say, concept, if you will. And I just want to go back is that it's an irony of history, not irony of history, it's irony in history, that while the advanced, enlightened Western Europe was declaring God is dead, there is no such thing as this revealed morality and you have to live by it and stuff like that, the Abrahamic religions made their mark, particularly Judaism, at that very moment in time. I cannot think of any bigger...
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if all of
it... You said something.
I don't know if it wasn't a consensus in Western Europe, but it was certainly born of Western Europe, that Nietzsche idea. You're right, of the end of biblical morality. Yeah.
The thing is, look, the reason I say that it wasn't a consensus, but I'll just share my experience with you. I've been to the States, and I've been to Western Europe, particularly Britain, for example, Cyprus, Greece. I've been to these countries. The religious influence that I found in America, despite America is a free country, pluralistic, and this was the 90s, was much more compared to what I saw in Europe. It's a bit difficult for me to describe it, but if I say it in a simplistic way, just to explain my point, I found Americans more into the religion side compared to their European counterparts.
Mm-hmm.
Today in England, for example, the official statistics I came across a few years ago, the most followed religion, and I don't know if we should call it a religion, but the most followed religion in England is atheism. Do we find a similar situation with their American cousins? Yes, religiosity may not be there, that people are not observing Lent, or let's say if we take the Jewish community, like you said, that a lot of them, because they are assimilating and they are marrying Gentiles and they are losing their culture, and then similar dynamics are also occurring within the Muslim demographic, but still religion is a very important part in America to this day compared to their European counterparts. I may be wrong in that.
Yeah, I mean, America is a more religious country, for better or for worse. But yeah, there was this. The thing about America is that there's no specific geography that's been around for 1,000 years. It's not a country of one people, like France is for the French, or Poland is for the Polish. There's no one ethnicity. There's no one religion, even though the majority is Christian, specifically, until fairly recently. There's no shared history that goes back more than 10, 12 generations. It's a young country from that perspective. What there is and that sort of supersedes any religion, is the American ethos. Basically, the idea is if you're an American, if you want to be an American, you have to all buy into these values. And these values are monotheistic values at their core. But the idea is that you can be a Muslim, or you can be a Christian, you can be a Buddhist, you can be, whatever. You can believe in a flying spaghetti monster. It doesn't matter. If you're in America, as long as you buy into the American ethos, that supersedes everything else. And I think that's part of the strength of this culture. It allowed people to go above differences and connect on a different level. And I think it's part of the secret sauce.
Okay, I have to ask one very troubling question because you clearly mentioned the rise of anti-Semitic attacks that are occurring in not only in Western Europe but also in the United States, and it's taking us back to the same time when Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster were growing up in the United States. Then there is xenophobia, then there is tribalism, all of these things which are precursors to World War II. Are the conditions ripe for another iconic superhero that can be created, or Superman is like, to quote Francis Fukuyama, end of history?
Nice quote. In many ways, Superman is the alpha and the omega. He created the superhero genre, but also exhausted all of it. Anything that came after Superman was a reaction to him. Nothing new under the sun, and he's the sun. That said, I think you're very astutely touching on that culturally. I don't think we're on the verge of a third world war just because the nation states are not the same, but culturally we're in a similar place where borders are shifting, populations are shifting, concepts of reality are shifting. Everybody's becoming, more tribal, more atavistic. There's a lot less tolerance, a lot less patience, a lot less communication. There's a rise of hatred on all levels. We're seeing this everywhere in the world, but including in America. I don't know if that's going to give rise to the new superhero. I think that concept is sort of perfected with Superman, but I do think it's part of why we see the rise of the superhero genre in general. I think it's why we have the success of the MCU and DCEU and CW and HBO Max and all the other acronyms, right? I think part of the reason, there's a lot of reasons, and it's, unless you interview everybody who sees these movies, there's no way to really know, but I do think part of the reason why these things are so popular is because we need heroes. We need people that show us we can, different people can come together and work for one cause. We need people who remind us about our potential, about our obligations to each other.
Okay. Another troubling aspect I have to ask you is that there is an attempt, particularly I see that coming in from the left, if you will, that they are basically trying to dilute the concept of superheroism by making it less about values and more about either sexual orientation, ethnic identity. Do you see that as a threat to some of the to this ideal concept that we have right now?
I don't. I don't know that it really is coming from the left as much as it's catering to a young audience, which in America, the younger you go, the more left you're going to be, just demographically. And I think that's just a natural occurrence of that. I just don't see it as necessarily diluting. Superheroes reflect the world we live in. I'm personally comfortable with, whatever. Everybody can be happy. There's the world, we can reflect it. That said, having said that, what I do think is problematic isn't in a particular representation of this sexuality or that ethnicity or whatever. It's when the metaphor steps ahead of the story. It's when it becomes preachy.
Yes.
For example, the Supergirl show. So the first season was very light and very fun, and then it sort of deteriorated. By the last two seasons, it was unwatchable.
Yes.
Because what it felt like to me was that it was barely a story. The story is just there as an excuse. What it was is somebody standing on a soapbox and lecturing me about all the woke points I needed to hear. So when that is an organic part of the story, it doesn't bother me. If they have a story where Supergirl's sister has a hard time coming to realize that she's attracted to women, it doesn't bother me because it reflects the real world, and that's fine. when there's no story, when a show about Supergirl is only about her sister's journey of self-discovery, well, I didn't come here to spend half an hour about her sister. The show is called Supergirl. I want to see Supergirl. I want to see her fly and punch things. So I'm okay with all of it, and nothing disturbs me. I don't find anything diluting. Nothing. I'm comfortable with anything, but I want the story to be first, the metaphor to be second. And if we bring things back to Superman, imagine if a Superman comic would be him sitting around saying, "Oi, I'm an immigrant. Nobody likes me. Why can't Americans be nicer?" What is that? That should be, you know what I mean? And that's what we're getting from entertainment. It's when it's contrived, when it's fake and artificial, it bothers me. When it's built organically into the story, I'm absolutely happy.
This is where I want to ask you this thing that you just mentioned, because you elaborated it in the ideal way, that the metaphor comes before the story. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I mean, that's what happens when I don't like it. What I want is the story first, metaphor second.
So
metaphor should be the underlying,
Is this approach problematic? And I'll just give you my background to it. I am not impressed at all with Kamala Khan, Miss Marvel. The reason is that knowing how Muslim society thinks, especially in the diaspora, because I have relatives in the diaspora as well as here, and plus I have had the opportunity to interact and engage with Muslims from other communities. It doesn't show me something that is reflective of my world, other than the fact that she is a Muslim from a middle class background. And at the same time, it's I asked a simple question. I say, it took Dick Grayson almost 50 years to evolve from being a sidekick to Batman to becoming an A-list superhero himself. It took almost 60 or 70 years for Bucky Barnes to evolve from being a teenage sidekick to Captain America, to becoming an anti-hero, to becoming an A-list superhero, and one of the most popular in MCUs. Characters like Kamala Khan are getting a free pass. Characters like America Chavez are getting a free pass. Characters like Jonathan Kent, son of Superman. I mean, Batman has a son called Damian Wayne, whose mother is Talia al Ghul, whose grandfather is a nasty guy. And Batman has a no-kill policy. Damian sees things the other way. And yet, everybody loves this father-son relationship. And next thing you know, when I saw Superman, son of Kal-El, it hit me just exactly the way you just described, that it was metaphor and less story. Because why? We just want to grab the headlines, and especially among the woke audiences, that, okay, now Superman is like. So this is, in my opinion, something which I feel that threatens the superhero genre.
It's sometimes hard to say. The example of Supergirl that I brought up, I really had a very, and again, this is just my interpretation. I could just as easily be wrong. Maybe if we interviewed the writers, or the head writer of that show, they'd say, no, it was really born out of the adventure storylines, and we just thought it was. But to me, it read as very preachy and only lip service story, right? Personal essays disguised as adventure stories. I don't, but sometimes it's hard to say. So to me, for example, when I was reading Son of Kal-El, that didn't come across that. Maybe like the decision to say, oh, let's make the character gay or bisexual, or whatever, I think questioning, whatever the sort of unclear, didn't come to me as, maybe the decision was born in the executive room rather than the writer's keyboard. But the story itself seemed more organic to me, and I was comfortable with it. Of the three characters you described, Kamala Khan, Jonathan Kent, and Bucky Barnes, Kamala is actually my favorite. Well, not Bucky Barnes. There was another one we mentioned. Who was it? But Kamala kind of she's a cute character. Oh, America Chavez. So I don't care for the character of America Chavez. But I kind of like Kamala Khan. Not, she's fun. She's cute. And, the writer, G. Willow Wilson, is a Muslim woman, American Egyptian. I'm going to have to trust her that she writes something that she knows, although, I don't know that, but the Muslim community in New Jersey, it's not something I'm that familiar with. But it had verisimilitude. It rang true as a teenage experience like anybody else. So one person is a Pakistani Muslim home, another is just conservative, another is Catholic, whatever, right? Um, but I thought with that character, they managed to really strike a balance between her ethnicity being something that was actually a part of her story and not by the way, but also not overtaking her story. She was still a superhero.
Right.
And from the little bit I've seen from the trailers, they got a really good actress to play her. She
No
seems
doubt.
very
No doubt.
adorable. Um, and we'll see, we'll see how the stories go. And there've been stories that I liked more of Kamala, and there's stories that I liked less of Kamala. America Chavez, between you and me, don't tell anybody, I think is a very kind of contrived character. I don't think she's all identity, no personality.
Yes.
Like I just, you know what I mean? But it ranges. It ranges. I tend to be. It's not a question of open mind. It's a question of sort of laissez-faire. I don't really care. I'm comfortable with anything, as long as it serves a purpose. And then the question is, what is the purpose? And if it's a good story, then I'm on board, no matter what it is.
I have the similar thing because I never felt how should I say disturbed when I came across North Star, for example, back in the 90s. Alpha Flight.
Yes, I remember. He got married.
A very good character created by John Byrne. There is an progression that you see in his storyline. There is something like you said, that the story is coming before the metaphor. We even have a bisexual character called the Hercules, who is also a member of the Avengers. The story was always taking precedence, and I'm glad to hear that you are one of the fans of Kamala Khan. But I just personally feel that it's like characters like Kamala Khan, America Chavez, and Jonathan Kent, because Superman's son is Superman is a very beloved Clark Kent character, and for him to be having a son, and his story deserves to be more developed before we ran into the identity side of things and these marketing gimmicks. This is just my personal opinion on that part. But I really feel sorry for characters like Dick Grayson and Bucky Barnes, because these guys, the writers, paid a great deal of attention over the decades just to bring them where they are. This is what my take is.
It's an interesting case that Dick Grayson, a few years ago, they started playing around with the idea of revealing, not as like a big reveal, just kind of threading it into the story. He came from a circus, so making him partly white, partly Roma, gypsy, partly Romani. There are a couple of stories that mention that and that he's Romani, and then they sort of abandoned it.
Yeah.
I can't say it's a subject I've given that much thought to, but I think bring it back. I mean, how many Roma superheroes are there? And why can't he be? Makes sense. He was supposed to be a generations in circus family, when it doesn't, again, when it's just part of the tapestry, I think it can only add.
And one thing, as you touched upon this story about Dick Grayson, I think this book of yours is the best chronicle that we have about DC Comics not remaining consistent with its storylines throughout the decades.
Oh, sure.
I mean, I used to think Superboy was a problem, but after reading the book, I realized that DC has a cultural issue. And before I prolong the interview, because I've taken quite a lot of your time, I want a final statement from you, because right now, yes, people from the United States are going to be watching this interview. People from Western Europe are also going to be watching this interview. What do you have a message based on your book for people who belong to the Arab and Muslim world vis-a-vis Superman?
Well, first of all, given the time of the year, Ramadan Mubarak, Ramadan Kareem, right? That's first of all. We have what? Fitar is two weeks away, week and a half away.
6 days away.
So yeah, everybody happy holiday.
Thank you.
Oh, week away. Yeah, okay. So happy holiday and easy fasting and meaningful fasting and all that good stuff. Right before we started this official conversation, when you and I were chatting, you mentioned how you used to love Superman as a kid. You sort of moved on to other characters as an adult, and this book sort of reignited for him. And I thought that's like the biggest compliment I could ask for, because really, Superman is a symbol of our best self, right? Of our enlightened, benevolent, intelligent and giving selves. And that is something we all share. We're all one people, one humanity. There's so many stories where he could say, I only wish you could see the world the way I see it when I'm out of space. Just this one little fragile world in a sea of nothing, just one family. I think that's it. I think anything else you can say is a variation. Anything really comes down to that. It's humanity. We're all family. So I'm wishing everybody love and peace and a happy holiday.
Mr. Roy Schwartz, thank you very much for your time, for your valuable time. Thank you very much for this book.
Shukran, ma salama.
Ma salam, Habibi. And last, thank you for bringing people, especially people of the Abrahamic faiths, together.
I hope other people enjoy the book, and looking forward to hearing from them. And as always, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. So that was the interview with the famous comic book historian Roy Schwartz. I have posted this link in the description, and please give it a read and let me know of your thoughts. Thank you so much.